So, good afternoon, everybody. Energy blindness, the invisible foundation of our lives. We often think of awakening as something deeply personal, a moment when we begin to see ourselves or the world differently, a moment when something that was always there suddenly becomes visible. Over time, I've come to believe that this does not happen only to individuals. It can happen to societies as well. Societies too can remain asleep, especially about the systems they depend on the most. And sometimes it takes a disruption to wake the societies up. For me, that moment came during COVID. COVID was not just a crisis. For me, it was a revelation. For the first time, I was seeing up close how fragile, how complex, and how deeply our energy systems really are. Now, to most people, energy is simple. It is the LPG cylinder that arrives at home, the petrol pump where you go to get petrol or diesel, the lights that come on with the flick of a switch, the transport that runs, the airlines which function, so on and so forth. But during COVID, I saw the other side of this apparent simplicity. And it changed the way I think about energy. In normal times, Indian Oil alone delivers about 26 lakh of cylinders every day. But in April 2020, during the period of the COVID lockdown, that number rose to 33 lakh cylinders every day. Now think about this for a moment. A country was under lockdown. The roads were empty. Economic activity of the country was slowing down, and yet demand for one particular fuel, LPG, was surging. Why? Because people were at home, cooking more, anxious, uncertain. The hotels were closed. The food delivery systems were all closed. And like in every crisis, fear moves faster than facts. There was panic booking. People were not only asking for a LPG cylinder, they were really asking, will the system hold? And that question mattered. Because in a crisis, the first shortage people fear is often not the real shortage. It is the fear that the system may fail. So our challenge was not only to manage the supply, it was to restore confidence. Because every LPG cylinder reaching a home was not just a fuel delivery, it was also a message that the system was working, that the country was holding, that daily life, at least on this one critical way, will continue. But beyond that visible normalcy was an extraordinary complexity. To the ordinary citizen, it may sound simple. If LPG demand rises, produce more LPG. But a refinery doesn't work like a tap. You cannot simply turn on and turn off a tap, because when crude oil is processed, it yields a basket of products. It yields LPG, it yields petrol, it yields diesel, aviation fuel, bitumen, and many more. You cannot wish the other products away. So we were in a very strange situation. The one product people urgently needed was rising sharply. At the same time, the demand for transport fuels like petrol, diesel, and aviation fuel had fallen dramatically. That means the inventories of these products were building up. even as the pressure to produce more LPG was mounting. And there was one more complication. India imports a very large quantity, nearly 90% of its crude oil and 60% of its LPG. So crude cargoes are ordered about weeks in advance, depending on which geography they come from. Suppose they come from North America, it takes about 8 weeks of sailing time. If it's West Africa, it is 6 weeks, so on and so forth. So by the time the lockdown began, many of these tankers were already on the waters. So demand pattern on land had changed overnight due to lockdown. But ships carrying crude oil were still arriving at our ports. At the same time, LPG cargoes also had to be prioritized. So that created a very different operational challenge for the people. Ports had congestion, storage had to be managed, berths had to be sequenced carefully. So some cargoes were to wait, others were loaded urgently. But for the public, this was all invisible. All they saw was the LPG cylinder arrived on time. And this is exactly the point. Because for me, what struck was not the scale of the system, it was how little of it was visible to the people who depended on it the most. But there is another side to this story, which I can never forget. And for me, this was the most moving part of all. At a time when the country was being told to stay indoors, there were thousands and thousands of people who had no such option. People were unloading ships, teams were operating pipelines, teams were running refineries, teams were operating terminals, they were loading product into tankers and wagons. Drivers were transporting fuel across long distances and to each and every petrol pump. And petrol pump staff was reporting to work every day. And there was perhaps the most visible and courageous link of all, the LPG delivery man. When the whole country was anxious about infection and families were trying to keep their doors closed to the outside world, these men and women went from house to house, lane to lane, apartment to apartment, carrying cylinders, entering buildings, reaching our kitchens, and ensuring that the flames in the kitchen was always functioning. Everyone else was retreating, but their duty required them to step out every single day. This is something I can never forget. Because if the system held, it was not because it was automatic. It was because people chose to show up every single day. Behind every gas cylinder delivered during that period was not some supply chain algorithm. It was an act of courage. And that experience led me to a larger realization. Before COVID, our dependence on energy was almost entirely unconscious. We relied on it every hour of every day, but rarely thought about how it actually reached us. During COVID, that dependence became reality, but visible only through fear. People suddenly realized how much daily life depends on energy continuity. And even after COVID, something interesting happened. The fear receded, normalcy returned, and yet the deeper understanding remained limited. We had felt the importance of energy, but we had not fully understood it. COVID did wake us up, but only halfway. And I found myself giving this gap a name, the gap between dependence and understanding. And I call it energy blindness. Energy blindness is what happens when we depend completely on energy, but rarely give a second thought about where it comes and how it is produced, how it is moved, how fragile the system behind it can be, and who makes it work. If this talk today leaves you with just one thing, let it be this phrase, energy blindness. Because if awakening begins with seeing something clearly, then perhaps it is also beginning with naming something that we have not been seeing. Let me make this even more tangible. 1 barrel of crude oil contains about 5.8 million British thermal units, equivalent to 1700 kilowatt hour. A normal human being, in one day of 8 hours labor, physical labor, he does work equivalent to 0.6 kilowatt hour. So in other words, 1 barrel of crude oil packs the energy of nearly 4.5 years of physical labor. Think about that. In a sense, modern life is supported by millions of such invisible energy workers. Silent, powerful, and taken for granted. Modern life is not just powered by energy. It is built on invisible labor that we no longer recognize. And yet, when we discuss energy today, we often do it with remarkable simplification. We speak in slogans. We speak in binaries. We speak as if the world can be rearranged by intention alone. But the reality is far larger. Let me give you some numbers. Today, the world runs on the equivalent of 250 million barrels of oil, gas, and coal, all converted into barrels of oil. 250 million barrels every day. And yet, if you listen to many public conversations, you would think that we are already close to a world largely free of fossil fuels. Now let me be clear, renewables are growing. They are essential. They are a part of the future. But the point here is, we are not just transitioning energy systems. We are often misreading them. And that is also energy blindness. Today, with whatever trillions of dollars being invested for renewables, more than 80% of our energy requirement, primary energy, comes from fossil fuels. I am often asked a very simple question. We have so much sunlight. The solar costs are falling. The wind is growing. So why don't we just replace everything with solar and wind? It is a fair question. It's a very hopeful question. But it also reveals how easily we oversimplify energy. Because not all energy is the same. Some part of our system moves as electrons. Others moves as molecules. Electricity is electrons. It powers lights, fans, motors, and devices. But the fuel in your aircraft, the diesel in the truck, the petrol in your engine, the LPG in your kitchen, the feedstock for your fertilizers, chemicals, and many industrial processes, they are all molecules. Electrons are excellent for powering. Molecules are essential for storing, transporting, and delivering energy, where electricity cannot easily do the job. So the question is not which is good, electrons and molecules, and which is bad. That is not the right question. The real question is which form of energy is best suited for use. And once we start thinking in this direction, we begin to move out of energy blindness. Because the real world is not binary. It is about scale. It is about trade-offs. It's about reliability. It is about time. It is about physics. And it is about the systems. And now, just as we are struggling to understand the energy systems, we already have a new layer of blindness which is emerging. Artificial intelligence. Since November 2022, our lives have totally changed. Why? Because ChatGPT entered public life. Something fundamental has changed. All AI has moved from laboratories into our lives. It feels weightless, invisible, and effortless. You type a prompt, you get whatever you want. And it consumes 10 times more power than what you do on a Google search. But there is one part of the story we are not talking about enough. AI may be virtual, but the energy it demands is very real. Today, data centers already consume 2 to 3% of the global energy. And over a period of 2 decades, the number could rise sharply by 2040. AI and the data infrastructure could consume electricity on a scale comparable to an entire country like India. A single large data center can consume as much power as a city. And unlike many other systems, it cannot afford a failure. These facilities require what is called 5-9 reliability, means 99.999% power availability. In practical terms, absolutely uninterrupted power all through. Now think about that. We are building a future where some of the most advanced systems humanity has ever created will depend on near perfect, uninterrupted power. And yet, our public conversation on energy often assumes that supply can be variable, casual, or optional. We don't realize that we have to overhaul the entire electrical architecture. We have to revamp the entire electrical grids because all the grids are aging. We have to decide how much of dispatchable power, that means the power coming from gas, coal, or nuclear, is required in the grid for the grid to be stable, to give this sort of a reliability. We don't discuss that at all. And this is also energy blindness. We are embracing technologies of the future without fully understanding the energy systems required to sustain them. And this is why the theme of this event, Lexicon of the Awakening, matters so much. Because what we call things shapes how we understand them. If our language is simplistic, our thinking becomes simplistic. If our thinking becomes simplistic, our decisions become simplistic and fragile. Perhaps what we need today is not only better technology, we also need a better vocabulary, and a more honest one. A vocabulary that distinguishes between electrons and molecules, costs and reliability, aspirations and feasibility, visibility and dependence, and more importantly, energy realism versus energy feasibility. Because once we name something, we begin to understand it. And once we understand it, we can engage with it more honestly. So let me leave you with this. The biggest risk we face is not only that we may underinvest in the right form of energy, it is in the way that we misunderstand energy. Because when we are blind to something so foundational, we build narratives that are comforting, but they are incomplete. We build expectations that are inspiring, but they are fragile, shallow, and hollow. And we make decisions without fully seeing the systems beneath them. If awakening is about seeing clearly, then perhaps the first step is simply this: to recognize what we are not seeing. The understanding that modern life is held by convenience alone. No, it is held up by energy, by systems, and by people. And we need to shift. We not only need a shift in technology, we also need a shift in awareness. And that shift with awareness begins with overcoming energy blindness. Thank you very much.